How was Trump during your interview?
He's combative, confident. He sort of radiates a kind of confidence which not everyone is going to agree with, but he's got that sense that he thinks he's winning all the various battles across anything, and he still hasn't stopped thinking up new big ideas.
Yeah.
He's looking at things like the capital gains tax on indexation. He's looking at things. He was particularly bellicose, I thought, on Europe. He said that Europe was nearly as bad as China, and he's just rejected the offer on auto parts or on cars, which for the Europeans was a big deal.
Yeah, actually, I want you to stop there for a second, because we had not seen that, and frankly, there was a bump in the European auto stocks earlier today on the possibility of tariffs being removed. That's off the table now, you're saying?
He said that wasn't nearly enough, and that he wanted much more from Europe than that. So that wasn't a kind of starting chip. Again, I had the same impression that you did, that this was quite a big deal for the Europeans to offer it. But his response was, this wasn't enough.
John, judging from the reaction on Twitter, the big thing people are talking about is what he said about Jeff Sessions and the fact that he's safe till November, but that you said in the interview he didn't comment beyond that. What was he like when he did not comment? What vibe did you get from there about what he's thinking of?
I asked how many days after then, and he ignored the question. But I think I don't think it's just Trump. I think there's a general noise out of the White House at the moment that Sessions is okay through to there. What Trump then went on quite a lot about was the idea that he wanted Sessions to be looking at other things, especially to do with the Democrats and not just him. And at the end, he returned to the idea that he thinks it's impossible to impeach a successful president.
Okay. What about in terms of, did you talk about his reaction on the markets? Because it's interesting, from the shot across the bows to China today, we did see the stock market fall. Is he aware of his interaction with the stock market? Did you get that sense that he feels he's sort of omnipotent in that way?
I think he sees himself as part of, he looks at the stock market as one indicator of how well he's doing. He's proud of the economy. I think he a little bit mystified by why he might get beaten in the midterms, given how well he sees the economy going. Obviously, outsiders might say that isn't wholly his achievement to have got that far. I think generally, we asked him, for instance, about the fact that he keeps on bashing the main companies that are behind that huge surge in the markets. Joe and I have talked about this for years, but you look at Google, Facebook, Amazon, these are the very companies that are driving up the stock market. These are the ones which foreigners tend to be most envious of when they look at America, and yet they're ones that he seems to criticize most.
John, I want to go back to the capital gains and taxes, because a lot of conservatives have raised issues about the increasing deficit in the U.S. Did he talk at all about that, or how much support he had for essentially lowering taxes on some of these equity investments?
He actually asked us what we thought about the capital gains
Seriously?
issue, and where we pointed out, which is correct, that many other countries do actually have indexation on capital gains. It seems, in some ways, it's a reasonable thing to do. The issue is whether, it might be a tax cut which is more sensible than other tax cuts, but as you point out, it would add to the deficit.
And whether it would be good politics to lop on another tax cut for rich investors is probably also a question. Another line that he said with regard to monetary policy, he said, I'm not sure the currency should be controlled by a politician. It sounds pretty sensible. Like, when I read his comments about the Fed, other than that, okay, maybe he's not a fan of the rate hikes, he seems perhaps pretty respectful of the concept of Fed independence, which was something that I think people were curious about, whether he would have that view.
I think he's got more respectful. You basically have a man who loves running everything, and it's rather irritating to him that he can't control this thing. But actually, in this case, I think you have to give him credit. He seems to have walked back a bit from that. He was making much more bellicose noises about the Fed earlier. He talked a bit about being a businessman, that back then all he liked was low interest rates and a cheap currency, that he thought those were good, except when he was buying golf courses. And so that's his perspective. That's where he comes from. And he talks a bit, he did this in another interview, he talks a bit about wanting to be accommodated. But if you push him on that and say, what do you mean by that? He doesn't want to step over the line. So I think to that extent, it looks as if the Fed has begun to win that battle.
So it seems as though Jay Powell's safe. John, he thinks he is safe as well. Talk a little bit more about how the fact you feel that you can't impeach a sitting president as it stands.
Well, no, I think he thinks it's very hard to impeach a successful president, which is how very much he views himself, which he says he would give himself an A star, I think, in terms of his personal mark so far. So he doesn't. His point is that politically it's very difficult to do. On the midterms, he remains. He remains, I think, somewhat wary. But he thinks that if it was the midterms purely about him, he would do very well. You could argue about the rights and wrongs of that, but he thinks that he's doing very well with his base, that he's still got a kind of political clout there, even if that doesn't necessarily translate into him hanging on to the House in the midterms.